Hi everyone, I'm very honored to have Dr. Parthasarathi Shome with me. We know him very well from his work on taxation, but just to introduce him quickly, he's the chairman of the International Tax Research and Analysis Foundation in Bengaluru, and he's also a member of the Council of Eminent Persons at Tax Analysts of TNI in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Dr. Shome.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Shome, let's dive deep into India's tax policy landscape. And I think one of the things that it is hotly debated in India is the tax to GDP ratio. So there are some who believe that the tax to GDP ratio in India is quite low. I look forward to your comments on whether you think they are in fact low or what you think would be the ideal tax to GDP for India.
Well, excellent question, because this debate has been going on for at least 2 decades with which I've been intensely involved in this. If you look at who the tax collection is from, then you see that in all practicality, everyone that is taxable is being taxed. And with the advent of the GST in particular, like since it's a consumption tax and everyone is a consumer, everyone is in the tax net. And a big proportion of that cannot be included in the income tax base. Because the standard deduction has been revised from time to time for good reason. And so today, at a tax GDP ratio near 18% or so, that includes, as I recall, center, states, and a small amount, half to 1% of GDP at the municipality level. For a country like India, with India's per capita GDP, I don't think it is all that low. However, the distribution and the tax burden across the spectrum can be improved. Because if you really look at our tax structure, I don't want to start off saying that some people have to be taxed more, but the reality is that at the marginal rates of 10, 20 and 30%, the top rate of 30% together with the surcharge, etc., is still quite low with respect to comparable countries, even South Africa and so on and so forth. So I think that there we have to restructure our tax rates a little bit towards the upper income groups in India. Thereby we can improve our tax to GDP ratio, but there is really not much of much space. And now what happened was that by 2015, the direct tax portion had overtaken the indirect tax portion with respect to GDP. And the reality was that for never before that had happened. So the fact that direct tax went over and above GDP, direct tax to GDP went over and above indirect tax to GDP, that showed that we were really coming up comparably to most of the advanced and economies where direct tax is much higher. But again, around 2019, the customs tariffs were increased and GST had come along by 2017. So indirect taxes went up again, which meant that again the lower income groups were taking on the burden more. So we have to see to it in what way the direct tax portion to GDP goes up. And in order to do that, we have very little space, as I'm telling you. So the only way to do that is to still increase the upper marginal tax rate. If not, then we are here. I mean, where else can we move? The GST is quite comprehensive. The rates are not terribly low compared to the rest of the world. The only thing I find compared to the rest of the world which is low is the top marginal rates in India in direct tax, in income tax.
That's an interesting point you make, Dr. Shome. Sort of a related question on this is that in systems where there is more reliance on indirect taxes, there is a view that those systems are actually regressive. Do you subscribe to that view, or would you counter that?
Yes, I think that Regressive sounds very heavy, and probably it is heavy, but the fact is that if you think regressive, it means those who spend a high proportion of their budget on consumption and they can save very little, they are bearing a lot of the tax. And GST is clearly that. It's a consumption tax, and the lower middle classes and the lower classes who pay GST at the same rates, they are paying more GST in terms of their budget, because more of their budget is covered under the BJT in proportion to upper income groups. So to that extent, and given the heaviness of GST today, the system turns out to be a bit regressive. But remember that quite a bit of those taxpayers are excluded from the income tax base. So there is a quid pro quo. But I think we can, at the margin on the top, improve or reduce the regressivity by increasing the progressivity at the top range of the income tax. Otherwise, we will continue to be a little regressive.
Thank you, Dr. Shome. I think related to the question of raising taxes at the top income levels is also kinds of transactions that you can tax in a heavier way. You've done some work on the financial transactions tax many years ago, and I think every few years when the financial market picks up, there's conversation that can we use FTT like instruments, and this is a discussion globally, if FTT could be used as a revenue raising mechanism as well as to rein in markets. So do you think that these are good revenue raising measures, and can these be substitutes for regulation?
Yes, given that more and more Indians are participating in financial markets, in the share markets and all stock markets, at the individual income earner level, I think that they can be very good instruments, tax instruments. And financial transactions tax, one can see, well, on transactions you are putting this thing, and that is adverse to the purity of the markets. The fact of the matter is that markets never kind of have operated in a vacuum. There are always little distortions, but you have to see that the distortions balance out on the whole to the extent feasible, and then you have to live with those small distortions. And the financial transactions tax in those days when I worked on it was being thought of globally in a way, because the financial markets were very destabilizing. What did that mean? That as stock markets globally were increasing and stocks were increasing, as they increased, instead of a sell-off, what was observed was that people were buying more. So there was a strategy in a way to push up the prices, and this was probably done among the first, I remember, was Soros and his group of young brilliant people who were in that way building up models that destabilize the market. And why did they do that? Because the more they could push up and then work out an algorithm to sell off at a certain point when it was not expected, then they would have made the highest returns in the market, whereas others would face the market when the market had already crashed and they would suffer. And not that their intention was to make the others suffer, but their intention was to make the maximum gains. So it was thought that given that that was what was happening, we should find a mechanism where we can cap that destabilizing speculation off by putting a tax on those kinds of financial transactions beyond a point when the market was increasing, and use that, it was contemplated, for alleviating global poverty. But when the word went to some US senators, they made some very strong comments, and I was the repository indirectly of the group of economists who were working in that area. of that kind of comment that, what are these people doing? They'll destabilize the world, blah, blah, blah. So it really finally didn't take off. But the idea, to this day, I feel was a very good one. And there is still space to think of that. But when I look at again the political scenario, even when one looks at the way to tax internationally, whether you prefer a residence-based taxation or a source-based. Source-based is where the incomes are occurring along the supply chain, and residence-based is where the capital is located, especially in the digital economy, where most of the digital companies are located with their capital in the US, but the supply chain is all over the world, including India, China, and all that. There has been a strong movement supported by the OECD that it should become source-based, and we create a virtual permanent establishment, PVE concept, where the along the source is coming, you can tax them. But the US has basically opposed it. So I think it's very difficult politically to think of it, but as a concept, I think we can do it, if not for anything else, to kind of cut off, to the extent possible, destabilizing speculation on the financial markets of the world.
That's an interesting response, because you say that it can potentially, it's just about the timing, and you can rein in speculation by using such taxes. And I completely agree with you. It's all about political will. I guess India may be an interesting jurisdiction or country where we have a securities transaction tax. And I think our experiments with it have been quite successful in terms of revenue generation. I think also globally, in terms of digital taxes, we've looked at levies as an option, which of course have now receded because of the lack of consensus and US action. And I think I want to draw the connect to that and ask you a question now more on international tax. Which is to say, yes, there is this tension between source and residence countries, and it has been for a while. Dr. Shome, you've written a very elaborate report on anti-avoidance measures, which caught attention early 2010, I think.
2012. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think the Direct Taxes Code talked about it, and then you sort of worked very elaborately on it. So I think one of the questions that is usually posed to an anti-avoidance measure is that it's quite discretionary. It could be an overreach. But what would you think of anti-avoidance measures as a way to deal with practices across the world?
Yeah, I think sort of general anti-avoidance rules, or GAR, they are common now in most advanced economies, and emerging economies like India, South Africa, and others, and have also followed suit. In the case of India, when in 2012 it first appeared, the draft and the legislation was introduced and passed, it seemed that India had taken the most rigid elements from most countries and put them together under one law in India. And there was a global hue and cry against it. And so a governmental committee was formed by the Prime Minister of that time, who was managing the finance ministry in transition for about 4 or 5 months, and he formed this in reaction to global sort of comments and critical comments on India and Indian taxation. In fact, the US in fact said that they're going to stop double taxation avoidance agreements and all that, and unless all of this is corrected. So it was formed, and there we found that the main problem was that you cannot see that tax avoidance is curbed by presuming a tax evasive taxpayer. You have to be very optimal in your approach to set back and control tax avoidance. And that tax avoidance was occurring because of certain things. When a multinational based in India or abroad, mainly abroad, they had a local partner or subsidiary. What are the arrangements with them of the main one? Was the original intention of setting up that subsidiary to avoid tax? Was it to see that that the relationship between the two in terms of setting prices, between selling inputs outputs between them, done in such a way that it didn't reflect the market prices? All of these, and there were several other elements in it. So the GAR rules had to be set in such a way that the relationship between related companies was professionally comparable, as though the partners were not related, as though they were related only through the market. But throughout the Indian draft law, I mean it was law already, throughout the Indian law, it seemed that everywhere it was presumed that not only that particular element in the relationship did not follow anti-avoidance objective, but the entire arrangement between the main MNE and the subsidiary was completely set up in a tax avoidance space. So the committee had to redefine those relationships. What can be presumed, what you cannot presume. So the committee's idea was to ensure that the predisposition to assume that every taxpayer is a potential evader, that be set aside. And also, in order to ensure that, there was a panel that would look into an assessing officer's decision and then take senior officers and to check whether what was the intention and what was the ruling of the assessing officer. But we found that is not enough. That panel would have to have an independent member from outside academia, etc. So that was a big thing. It was a big shock to the administration, but we recommended it and that has been approved. So there were several elements that put in checks and balances towards GAR. But GAR is essential because even as far back as late 2000s, in the 10th plan, we found 2/3 of the companies in India were, not 2/3, about 1,300 companies in India, we had a sample, were paying only about 2/3 of the stipulated corporate income tax rate. So the tax incidence by companies was very, very low. So that's why we introduced the tracking in by 2006, the what is called tax expenditures. That is how much revenue is lost because of tax incentives and so on and so forth. So it is true that multinationals, domestic corporations, they find ways to avoid tax. So that has to be hemmed in and controlled.
So GAR is a necessary evil. Just related to that, Dr. Shome, if you have thoughts on, there is this global interest to have a floor on tax rates. So there is the pillar 2. How do you see GAR operating within that framework? You still see the relevance of GAR?
Well, firstly, pillar 2, which says you have to have a minimum tax, took a long time to be accepted. So I think the pillar the 2 finally as accepted was about 15% of corporate profits as a minimum. Most countries already had that, but whether effectively it would be 15%, it is not known, but it was 15%. However, that was in the previous US administration. With great difficulty, they said, okay, 15%. But the current administration, we don't know what is the position. And so until and unless it is actually signed off, we really don't know whether it will pass or not. And therefore, I think certainly on that basis alone, guard is essential. And even after that, that might be the minimum. But the minimum doesn't mean that because it's a minimum. Some companies may actually, given the whole scenario, it may be that their actual tax revenue to their income could be more than 15. So someone has to oversee what is the true taxability of that company. So if that, let's say they should pay 20%, suppose, or 18%, so it is much more than 15. So that if they are making the 20% through tax avoidance, they are making it 18 or 17, that has to be checked. So the need for guard will continue. It's how you administer it. You can't start, the administration cannot start by assuming that this person is a potential, or this tax person is a potential tax evader. On the contrary, they should begin with the presumption that this person has done his best to pay the tax. But what are the faults, what are the shortcomings of what they have done, and then adjust. So I feel that guard will be essential, but the administration and approach to guard will reveal the intention and practices of the tax administration, which also has to be controlled. That's why we insisted on an independent approving panel, and which is in place. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think in relation to GAR, another conversation that almost always comes up is that of tax uncertainty. And I think this is the conversation had by businesses very frequently, to say that India's tax system is very uncertain. So Dr. Shome, just to think about whether tax uncertainty is that important, and do you think that it has an impact on investment decisions?
Yeah, that's a question that addresses my heart. I like that question because I think, in fact, tax uncertainty is the most deprecating negative influence on businesses. They must have certainty in what they are doing. And what do I mean by that? The tax businesses, when they start, we say that, how much do they invest, where do they invest? They put everything together and they match that with their approach or attitude towards risk. And as far as risk is concerned, there are three attitudes, we say. One is risk averse. They don't like risk. They want everything to be clear, rules, etc. The middle is risk neutral. They can take some this way, that way, as long as it is neutral on the whole in a particular horizon, it's okay. The other one is risk avoiders. So they don't like risk at all. So what did I say? Risk preferer is the third one. So risk avoider, risk neutral, and risk preferer. Some people, they like risk, they don't mind, but the model to risk is known, and that is the first element. But uncertainty is a different thing. Uncertainty says that if you have a tax law today, let's say 2020, and on that basis you have your risk approach, you take a decision to invest, and you invest a certain amount of rupees, and but you know that there may be this risk, there may be that risk. It is all anticipated. You know the tax law. But in 2026, suddenly a law is passed which says that you made your investment in 2021, 2022, whatever. However, the tax law was not that at that time. The tax law we've changed not from now, but from 2020. So that completely destabilizes the risk model with which the business was working. So their whole calculation for the first 5 years or 6 years that they had operated on collapses. And that is uncertainty. And so in the context of retrospective taxation, that was another committee that followed immediately after the GAR committee. What my view was that kind of uncertainty with retrospective taxation creates what is called uncertainty, and therefore an impossibility to perform for the business. So that phrase I had coined, and I said uncertainty is to be avoided because of this problem. Now, what happened? That report was frankly widely acclaimed, but government at that time in which I had operated, though I was not a part of the government at that time, I was independently given the committee work. Government also said great, etc., but didn't take a final action on it. But the current government did declare that they would not take up any case with retrospective effect. So they said they are going to completely avoid going to court or anywhere in litigation with retrospective effect. However, they have still not, as far as I can see, abolished the retrospective application possibility if need be in the future. But they have promised and kept to that promise that they have not taken up any retrospective action on taxes. So one step forward is always good for businesses, but retrospectivity has to be abolished because it creates uncertainty. That uncertainty creates an impossibility to perform by businesses, and then the businesses maneuver. It's not that businesses are all like lame ducks waiting and operating. It's not like that. Government decisions in the boardrooms are very important, especially in India, but not the only decisions. It may be item M out of sort of P or Q items that they have to consider. So I think uncertainty is a very acrimonious and negatively effective element in business decision making.
So just to weigh in on that, is there other limits to which a tax administration can assure certainty? And when we talk about tax certainty, should policymakers also be looking at the certainty to the tax authorities, because taxpayers' behavior is changing constantly? Taxpayers' behavior is changing constantly. As you've seen across the world, companies performing in accordance to how tax laws are changing across jurisdictions, structuring more innovatively. So do you think that those should also be considerations in policy, and that may at times work contrary to what businesses expect?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question, because it's related to certainty and uncertainty, which is where I find that the discussions should lead increasingly. In other words, there should be certainty to the extent feasible on both sides. So don't leave the tax administration alone. That's what you are trying to imply. I agree. So, there was this, sometimes we create some uncertainty for the tax administration, which we should avoid. Like there was this, there were in 2005, 2 taxes were introduced. One was fringe benefits tax, and one was the bank cash transactions tax, BCTT, MBT and BCTT. Now, both were well intentioned because they were to avoid tax evasion. The first one was companies were giving special benefits to their employees and staff, especially high rates, like, there can be cafeteria coupons, there could be gyms, there could be holidays for the upper levels, etc. They were never reported, though they were supposed to. but they never reported. So FBT said that you have to list all of them and say how much you have spent, and we divide into 3 categories, and said in this category, let's say 1/3 of that expenditure will be taken and kept as taxable. In this one, let's say half, in this one 2/3, and they would be taxable. But in order to see what was being given and spent, because suppose you allow so much expenditure, doesn't mean that a staff member will be using all that. They may be using less of the allocation. So you had to do that, and it became impossible to monitor, and the tax administration didn't know what to do. They were saying that we've been given this task, it's our job to scrutinize every little detail. That's our job. You cannot tell us to take an average, because then we will be sort of called upon that whether we are corrupt or not, etc. So, and there was a hue and cry against it from the taxpayer of keeping all those details. So that didn't work. So tax administration was opposed to it. There was another tax, the same 2005 introduced, and both were then eventually abolished in 2009. The second one on bank cash, that was to control black money, and there was a lot of hawala or sort of roundabout circular transactions through banks. So a limit was put on of individuals how much they can remove daily. I think it was 50,000 or something, and on non-individuals it was, I don't know, 1 lakh, 5 lakhs. I think around that amount. That was a limit that was put, and that didn't have such opposition from the administration. Or from the media. The FBT was opposed by the media like anything, but that was also removed in the same budget in 2009. So what I'm saying is that the administration should also be assured that we are giving them taxes that they can operate and administer in a practical manner. If you give them an impossible job, then we are not giving them that certainty. But on the other hand, we tried to create that large taxpayer unit where both the indirect taxes and direct taxes, the higher upper groups of taxpayers would be treated together. So they would have one office, one window for all their taxes. So it would facilitate the work of the tax administration. But the problem there again, policymakers, one finance minister likes it, that even within the same overall administration you have another finance minister who didn't like it. And I suppose it still is there, it's fledgling, but by now it should have covered much larger group of taxpayers, because in most advanced economies today the two departments are joined. In our objective was eventually all taxpayers should be covered in one department. In India, the problem is that the promotions, this and that, and how many people are on the top, and all of that we had worked out how it would be. One's from this side, one from that side, etc. But they would all operate. But at least for the LTUs, it would. We thought, at least I thought, that it would be very beneficial for the tax administration also. And I think most at the functioning level, much of the tax administration, the young brilliant tax officer that I used to work with, they were very much in favor of LTUs, and they liked the potential of corresponding and establishing relationships with the other side. Even though the direct tax department being very large or larger, the other side, the indirect tax department, they felt that they don't get enough attention, not all the information, etc. So that was a frictional issue for the time being. I thought all of that would be worked out like in other cases. There were 50 countries that already had very functioning LTUs. But I think even today the LTUs in India have much more potential, and the tax administration officers, I have worked with them, there are some brilliant people who have great degrees even before they join the revenue service. So the new generations have to work it out of tax administration and work together. That will give them much more confidence as a tax department. They won't be put in competition with each other. So there are many ways in which we can provide. And the other most important thing, I think, is that one recommendation we made was that in India, in the UK, for example, a tax officer, when he signs something, he is taxing as a representative of the department, and no one questions that. He does it, and that is the end of it. Whereas in in India, there is, like in faceless assessment, there is no final responsibility. No one knows who has signed it. No one knows who has done what. And so as a result, the tax officer is not given the independent stature and recognition of his work, and that has to be also given. So the uncertainty on the tax officer in this aspect also can and has to be removed. There are elements like that, some of which are very important. So I liked your question, that what certainty can we provide to the tax administrator?
Thank you so much, Dr. Shome. I think that's a very broad overview that you've given us of the Indian tax system. And thank you for sparing time to talk to us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Suranjali.